I think at this point, I wouldn't worry so much about Redux and all these kind of things. It's just good that you're being exposed to kind of the new way of doing it because everyone right now, especially if you take like coding boot camps and stuff, they'll they'll teach you and stuff about Redux and everything because the content is still kind of behind. So this is kind of bleeding edge, I would say, and new. Probably just in the last, what would you say, JC? 6 months, 8 months?
It came out, well, hooks really started coming out in full force, I think, in the beginning of, I would say it's about, yeah, 8 months ago,
Yep.
9 months ago.
And then context in a big way, which obviously followed hooks, because people are still using Redux with hooks in a big way. So I would say the context has really taken hold almost what 3 or 4 months, where everyone's just kind of switching now. So you're seeing
Yeah,
a
and I
steady
think
start here.
you guys will find it fairly intuitive, to be honest.
Hmm.
It's nice, right? And I'll show you, there's a couple different ways that you can pass state around between the different components. And I'll show you one of the initial ways, which is just passing through props. So we'll do a little bit of refactoring with our vehicle cards, and we'll pass the properties down into that card through props. But you'll see that you don't necessarily want to use that to try to pass it around all around the application, because you could end up passing properties through components that don't really need those properties, but yet you want their children to have them, right? And so you can feel like you want the gorilla, but you're going to get the gorilla uh, and the banana and the whole forest, right? So
I enjoy the analogy, JC, because you're actually in a rainforest. Well, not
Yeah, I
quite.
was going to say, said from someone who's in Brazil.
Yeah, right.
uh,
A little bit further south of the rainforest, but
they
close.
do have they do have marmosets here in Rio,
All
like
right.
little, yeah, little, like the tiny little monkeys.
Little monkeys, yeah.
They're cute.
Do,
Yeah,
do,
you just don't want to get.
do they hang out on the streets? I mean, are they rodents?
No,
Right.
they typically, you'll see them if you go into somewhere that's a little bit more wooded. Like there's a lot of actual natural kind of rainforest inside of the city itself. And so there's a lot of places in the city where you can go on hikes that make you feel like you're in the middle of the forest, right? And the moment you kind of go off of the urban area and you go up one of these hills onto a hike, you'll see these monkeys hanging out all across the trails, principally because people give them
Feed them.
food,
Yeah, feed them.
right? So
I'm sure. I mean, I don't know where you guys are from in India, but I'm sure wherever you guys are from, it's. I know that monkeys and baboons can be quite rodent-like problems too. So,
We visit our home
no,
daily though.
okay.
yeah. I have heard of like some other places in Brazil where there's been some cases of like a decent sized monkey coming into somebody's apartment, right? Like as they were building a condominium kind of into their habitat, right? But yeah, here in Rio, that's not a problem.
Cool. You want to get started? I think we got everyone.
Yeah, let's do it.
JT's a ghost, but I think he's here.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay.
All right.
It's one of those weeks.
Are you still doing floors, or you finally done? You back to actually, earning real money?
No, Rob unchained me and let me come home.
All right, that's good. That's good.
All right. Everybody able to see my screen?
Yep, got it.
All right. So tonight our objective is we've got this front end here, got our nice home page. We got vehicles. This will even hook up to MQTT, right? That's what we managed to get it through last week. Now, this week, what we're going to do is we're actually going to put all the stuff behind our lock and key. So we're going to set up a login page. We're going to force the user to authenticate with the backend to be able to access any of this data. And we're going to manage the state in the front end such that it can actually pass around those credentials, not only to the REST routes, but also to the MQTT broker. So we'll enable authentication on the MQTT broker. And then once we get all of the plumbing put in place to actually pass this data around internally and inside of the front end, we'll embellish some of the other pages. For example, we'll bring up some data about our some aggregate data about our vehicles on the home page, and that honestly should take us all the way through the end of the night. All right. The first thing we need to do though is get these undefineds taken care of. So that's just a quick hydration that we got to do here on the back end. So I'm going to open up the cloud. All right. If we look at this index, we hydrate a vehicle, right? And just to refer to where in the front end this is happening, here's front end React. I go down to the vehicle screen. You can see where this header is supposed to be defined here. This vehicle heading, it's this vehicle.make and vehicle.model that's missing. And really what it should be now is vehicle.model.make and vehicle.model.name, if we refer to the way the tables are set up. And what we'll do is we just need to add a hydrator in here. So I'm going to come in here, a list of hydrators. I'll copy and paste this user hydrator and make a vehicle model one. All right, so we'll hydrate vehicle model. We don't have a password to worry about. That's really all we need to do. Just get rid of that ID. There's nothing else on the vehicle model we want. But what we want to do here in vehicle, remember we fetched the model ID. We just want to hydrate the model of the vehicle on top of the vehicle object. So we can import that. And this is really where making sure that you pass all of your data through hydrators starts to shine, because I don't even have to look through my route handlers. I know that we've gone by the convention of always hydrating a vehicle before we return it. So now anywhere that a vehicle is going to get returned, as long as if I update the hydrator, I'll update the way it gets returned. All right, so all we need to do to hydrate the vehicle model, we want to pass in the model record. All right, and then we can just attach that to the vehicle. Now when this thing returns, we want to grab the make and the model, right? We look back at the table. It's not called model anymore. There's actually a model object, and the model object has a name, but it also has a make. All right. So I'm going to go back into the front end. Right here. And so we know that this is going to be vehicle.model.make, right? And then vehicle.model.name. Let's see if this works. Should be rebuilding. There we go. All right, so we got our names again. So at this point, what I want to do, I mentioned that we're going to work with the first way you can pass data around in React, which is through props, right? But we need a component. Remember that very first lecture when we were talking about React, we mentioned, oh, everything is done in components, right? Well, if we look at the way we've got our vehicles component here, come up to the top, anything that you're exporting like this is considered a component. In this case, because we're not using a class nomenclature anymore, this is considered a functional component. That's what they call it. So this functional component, what we want to do, instead of returning all of these divs, which are these like vehicle cards that we're building up, we can actually refactor this and build our own vehicle component to just simplify this this particular vehicles page a little bit. And if we wanted to in other places, we could reuse that card, right? So we don't have to use it exclusively here. So what I'm going to do is inside of library, navigate into library here. All right, I'm going to make another directory called vehicle card. And inside a vehicle card, we'll make vehicle.js. All right. Now what we want to do to make our functional component, define vehicle card here. It's going to be equal to a function that accepts props. Now pay attention to this. This is how we're going to pass that data down. And then it returns something. In this case, let's put a div here at the moment. All right, and then the default export, vehicle card. Now to actually make this a functional component, the other thing we got to make sure we do is to import React. All right. So it's coming here. This is what we really want to be returning, right? We want to turn this whole thing into its own component. So I want to grab everything from up here at the start of the div down to 37 lines. Copy that. We can bring it right in. All right, so this here is what we're wanting to return. Now, some of the stuff that we've got to grab, all right, this technically doesn't need a key itself anymore. We'll put the key to the actual component, but we do need our styles. So I'm actually just gonna copy this styles because the majority of them are already here. All right. Rename this file vehicle card. We can import from the vehicle card module.css. All right, that way we can get all these little different class names coming in. Now, what you're gonna notice is we want this kind of stuff coming off of vehicles. So now how do we get that? That's actually gonna come in through this prop. So I can destructure the vehicle from props. All right. And let's just make sure we have everything here. So we need to construct this vehicle heading. Let's go back into our vehicles. You can see we construct that from the vehicle itself as well. So let's copy that over. So vehicle year, model make. Okay, so we have our heading. Vehicle has color. It's got HUID. That really should be about all we need for this vehicle card. So now let's come back up and we're going to import this guy. So here, import vehicle card. Go into our library where we're holding these components, right? And now what you'll see is we can use this just like its own tag, just like we use, for example, this vehicle hook. How we use that vehicle hook up here in app, right? Should be, I guess it's actually being exported as vehicles, right? Let me rename that real quick just so we don't get confused. Let's call this vehicles, right? All right, so just like we're importing vehicles here, and this is its own component that we can use. It could be like navbar is imported. Vehicle is its own component now, and it can be used and passed in lieu of these cards that we've constructed manually here, right? So initially what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy and paste this return. Let's see. All right. What we can return is actually a vehicle card. All right. And then this is right here is how you pass the props down. So it's just attributes on the component that you're passing back. So we just need to pass on a vehicle. And we don't even need the vehicle heading anymore. So it's either going to get this vehicle card list, right? Or it's going to get, if it has no vehicles, a P tag with no vehicles found yet. So let's make sure we didn't break anything. All right, moment is not defined. Vehicle data is not defined. So we've got a couple things that are missing from this vehicle card. Come up here, we can grab our moment import. Right? And then if we're looking here, here's vehicle data. We don't have vehicle data right now. I'm gonna grab vehicle data. Which means we need to pass vehicle data down as well into the card. All right. There we go. Now we're back in business. Home vehicles. So we can clear all this out. Do a little cleanup here. And now you can really see, I think it makes it a lot easier now to reason about what's going on here. We've got this vehicle card list that we're trying to build up, right? And we've got this list of vehicle data. And what we're wanting to do is convert those to a list of cards, right? And then we resolve the cards here, right? And then we put those all inside of a card container that can organize them into our grid. So I'm going to clean this up as well. And you see how much shorter this is getting already, right? So let's go ahead and save this section. All right, so we can see the different files that have changed. We updated the hydrator in the cloud, so our backend, and then we refactored the vehicle cards into their own component.
So JC, I see that you're cleaning it up and it's a lot shorter, but what it seems to me is you've transferred some of the code into another file. So does it actually make it shorter, or are you just cleaning up the structure so that it's cleaner in terms of what so each component is essentially separated?
So,
or are you
go ahead, sorry.
Or are you actually reducing what's needed to go into the system?
So it's a good observation. We have not reduced the overall number of lines of code, right? And there are plenty of people who can make a very good argument as to, if you're not going to reuse it, keep it there in the same file, right? So that you don't have to kind of search around the directory structure to find different pieces of code. And that's somewhat of a stylistic, I guess, stylistic taste. The argument that you can make about these vehicle cards is that we can reuse them easily now, right? So we've made them modular. Another reason that I went ahead and did this was so that we could have a illustrative example of how to pass data through props, right? So you can see in this, for example, the vehicle card component, that it gets access to vehicle and vehicle data exclusively through props. If something doesn't supply those things through props, it cannot render itself, right? And if technically though, if we weren't going to reuse this, I couldn't give you a good reason other than style why you would want to create a separate card component for this.
But I think you said that a lot of the stuff that you do in coding, you reuse a lot of it, and that's why you guys architect it this way.
Correct. So if it gets, I guess what I'm saying is with where we're going to take this front end tonight, this vehicle card is not going to get reused, right? But it is structured in a way that it's very easy to reuse at this point.
You can probably imagine that a vehicle card is a pretty typical thing that you'd have all the way through the system, and you probably will reuse it again. And if you do, then you only update it one place, right? So my rule of thumb is I'll start by coding everything kind of inline, but the minute that a line of code starts to get duplicated, I take the extra little bit of time and then abstract it into its own function, component, class, whatever, so that and that's that way I don't fall into the architecture rat hole of abstracting too much, because you can spend all your time abstracting and never actually get any work done. But that way you can also, as long as you're somewhat disciplined, that's a pretty effective way to approach how to make that decision as to whether or not to make something a function, or abstract it to a point or keep it in line.
And this props is a built-in object of React itself.
Yeah, so props is this is a standard way to pass data down through React.
So yeah, so that props is actually very interesting. Props is simply just the attributes that are on a component. So if you look at one of these components, like Justin, yeah, this will become more clear too. But you'll notice that there's a vehicle property on this vehicle card component. You see that, the vehicle data and vehicle.
Right.
We're passing those in. Those are just props, and that random prop he just made. And
Okay.
those will actually get passed down into the down into that component as props. It's just an object with those mapped. So always keep in mind JSX is just syntactic sugar. What's underneath all those nice, those little carrots and all that kind of stuff is a function, and it's called react.createComponent. And it takes as arguments the props and a few other things. And so it's basically just a nice, literally a syntactic sugar that just wraps a function. And so that's what's actually gets passed as the props are what get passed into that create component function, so that on the implementation side of the component, they can be used. It'll become more clear as Justin keeps going through this and shows how to pass stuff down through components, and also why we start using context, actually.
Right. And so you guys see how you can define the props to be whatever you want them to be? I mean, it's essentially the props are the list of attributes on the tag. So when you use the component here, you can provide a list of attributes. And this is very standard HTML, right? For example, for an image tag, you're going to have an SRC attribute for the source of the image, which is what we have when we actually render these vehicles, right? So if I go into the vehicle card itself, class name is an attribute on different HTML elements, and you can consider a React component sort of like a superset of a HTML element, in the sense that it is made up of HTML elements typically, and it itself can also have its own attributes. But going to the image example, let's see if we can find that one here. So this one got sent in as style. So there's a style, but you can see here for an IMG tag, there's a source prop, right? And the idea there then is that when you use one of your components, just like you would use, it's sort of like you're defining your own HTML tags. When you use your own components, you can define your own attributes. And props are just the list of attributes that are available, right? And they get passed down as an object where each of these attributes is a key on that object, which is why I was able to define random prop up there and then pull it off of the props here. Does that make sense?
Understand? Yeah.
All right. So we're gonna just do one other refactor real quick. And inside of source, I'm going to make a folder called custom hooks. All right. And inside of there, I'm gonna make a file called mqtt.js. All right. And then we're going to grab this use MQTT because we want to be able to use this in other components as well. All right. So there's nothing, this MQTT was written really well and it's generic. And right here, this does not really depend on this vehicle's component. So we'll put this on our own kind of library so we can use it later. But what we're going to need to do is import a couple things. So I'm going to import React. As well as MQTT. All right. Then we can import this guy from our custom hooks. Just use MQTT, then remove it from here. All right. All I did there was just move the actual use MQTT hook to its own file. That way we can reuse this if we need to in some other places, right? So the next thing that we need to do, I'm going to do this because you guys are going to see, we're going to create a login screen. And with our login screen, we don't want to necessarily have this structure that we have here, where we have an H1 and then our nav bar and then this switch, because what we're going to need to do is come up with a login screen that actually is in one of these routes. And in order for us not to end up showing this H1 and nav bar as part of the login screen, we need to be able to essentially bake this structure here, this H1 and nav bar, into the resolution of the home and vehicles page. So what we're going to do is make a generic layout. I'm just going to call this layout here and then make a layout.js. All right, and this is just kind of the generic layout of the app. And so I'm just another functional component. We'll call it layout. We want to import React at the top and then export this. This will make more sense as soon as this gets implemented. So this we want to have include our nav bar as well. All right. And then it will return set of div. All right. And then I'm going to grab, let's look at our app.js. We want an H1 and our nav bar, right? And then the next thing that we're going to do, this is going to be a little bit interesting. So I'm going to have a main tag, and then we are going to, off of props, we're going to grab a property called children. Now what's this? This is what happens, or this is what you can access when your component has child components, all right? So I'm going to update this app.js to use this layout here, and you'll see what's going on. So import layout. right? So instead of baking all this here in, we can get rid of these two. And we're not going to auto close this route. Inside of this, we will have layout. And then inside of layout, that's where we're going to show home. All right, so I don't have to put component in here now. So let's think about this for a second. When the route path is just a /, it's going to return layout, and inside the layout has home. So if we look at this layout component, what does it return? It returns a div, which has an H1 for the header. It returns a nav bar, and then it has a main section that returns all of its children, right? And then if we console log the children here, say layout children, when we go to the home tab, when we just get rid of this one here, right? Go to home, see layout children. What we should see, here, let me see here, children. What we should see for these children is this is that home class, all right? So since we put home inside of layout, it will bake our header and our nav bar on top of all of the elements that it encapsulates. Does that make sense? That allows us to reuse this layout for any of the components that we actually want to have inserted with the layout. So the rest of these here, we just have to update them real quick. This one will be the same, it's just path is home. All right. And then we also want one for vehicles. We can get rid of this here now. All right. So now we've moved that layout from being on top of the div for all class elements to only being applied to specific routes that we want. Now, visually, nothing's changed. All right. We go into vehicles here. It all looks the same. If you look at children, that one's home. We should see another one if it's going to show vehicles. This warning here was actually something I forgot real quick, guys. So we got to go back to our vehicles page here. And since this is returning these vehicle cards, we forgot our key. So for our key, like we had before, we'll just put vehicle.uid. It's just a way for the virtual DOM to be able to track these different elements, and it wants to have a unique ID to reference them by. All right, so that went away. All right. Let's see what this guy's doing now. Open up vehicles. Type. There we go. So you can see this one's children is vehicles on this page. So I'll go ahead and comment that out. Is everybody understanding exactly what this layout component's doing here? It'll make more sense once we bring up the login page as to why we need this. No? All right. Save our progress real quick.
So you're just hiding the layout behind the login page once you get to it, right? That's kind of what you're doing?
Well, so the idea is, since this is the generic layout of how we want the app to look, is when we get into the front end, we want to be able to capture that in a generic way so that we're not constantly rewriting the layout every time we render a component itself. So it's reused, but we don't want to use it everywhere because not necessarily on every page that we're going to go to is going to have that layout now. And what you'll see is we're going to set up a login wall where if you can't get past it, you won't be able to see anything that is in the app. So you actually have to have a set of proper credentials to even see this layout. All right, so since we went through all that, now we can finally come here, we'll go into screens, we'll make a login screen. All right, so I made a folder called login inside of screens, and we'll make a file called login.js. All right, and just like the rest of them, we need to import React. Another functional component. I'll just show you guys this right now. Put the H1 in for now. It's going to be a login screen. All right, so if I come up here to app, get rid of nav bar there, we'll import login. All right, so what we want is we'll actually have, we're going to make our own route, and the component will equal login. We'll make that /login. All right, so the way we can access that, let's see here. Looks like we got a problem. Nope. All right. So at the moment, if we go straight to login, we can see login there, right? This is going to be a login screen. So you can see this doesn't have that layout in it, right? But the moment that we switch back to home or anything else, it will return that layout. Now, if we set the route up like this, then you would get the layout, but that's not what we want. So this login is going to be kind of fun because this is going to be the first time that we're going to send a post request to the backend. Because at the login, if you remember the way we have the login route set up, we need an email and we need a password, right? So let's start this way. I'm going to just make the header a div. I'm going to say FSSE, your login. All right. And then we want to set up another div because we're going to create a form, and this is going to be our container. So I've got a form here. We don't need an action right now. We will say put it on submit for the form. Make a small on submit function. All right. And then inside of the form, this is where we're going to have our different fields. All right, so we'll make a separate div for each of our fields. And inside of a field, you want to have a label. All right, and the HTML4 is going to it needs to match the name of the input that we're going to provide. So the first one will be email. And then we'll set up the input. All right, this is a typed text and its name is email. All right, so you want these HTML4 and this name to match. All right, we'll call this email for the actual label itself. And then there's a handful of things that you're going to have for an input. You want to have a placeholder. This is actually the piece of text that sits in there before you type anything into the input. We want to make it required, right? And then I'll add the second one here for the password. So HTML for password. Set the label password, right? This input is not type text, it's type password. The reason that we're going to use that is because it'll automatically mask the password while you're typing it in. So, you know, when you typically when you go onto a page or form, you start typing your password out. If in a situation like we're in right now, there's people watching your screen, you definitely don't want somebody to see your password as you type it, right? And so the name of this one will also be just set the password, and the placeholder will just say enter your password, right? Make that required as well. And then lastly, we need a button, all right? The type of this button is submit, and we'll just put sign in. Right, so let's take a look at this page now. So it looks like this on submit doesn't have anything right now. Oops, I forgot to put the handle submit in there. Now, one thing I forgot to add here, for this on submit, it actually gets access to an event object, and it's pretty standard practice that you call this prevent default behavior on this. And what that does is the standard default behavior for a form when it's submitted is to refresh the page. And we want to have control of that, right? It's a single page application, so we don't want our forms to be refreshing on us, right? So let's take a look here. All right, not looking very pretty, right? We got to put some CSS in here, but you can already see, you know, the start of a form coming together. All right, so if I look in the console and I type some kind of email, you can see them asking for the password. If I click sign in, I get this console log submit form, right? Now, what we want is we want to be able to access, right, within our component, the values that are getting put here in email and here for password, right? So does anybody have a guess as to how we can do that? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing.
In the handle submit, can't you create your database query there?
Yes, but what we don't have yet is access to.
Past the properties, yeah.
Well, what we're looking for is we want to try to actually access the data that's getting typed into this input field, right? So if we look down here, we've got this this input field here. We want to access this data, right? Now, I'll show you guys something here. There's another property. It's not necessarily a fair question because I haven't showed you this yet, but so there's an on change attribute for this input, and I can fire off an event, and we can console log what's going on here. So I'll console log e.target.value, which is what you get off of that event when it changes. So let's see. If I start typing in here, you can see in the console log, right? Every time the value in there gets changed. Now I've got somewhat of access to it, right? But that's just inside that function. How is it that we can take something inside of this function and pass it up into the component so the component has access to this current value? And with something that we used last week in our vehicles component.
Isn't it like a state, this.state?
Exactly. So it's our use state hook, right? So we can use state. And now what we want is we'll have two different state hooks here. We'll have email, right? And then we can call set email, use state hook, and we'll just set that to equal to an empty string at first, right? And then the same thing for a password. Right, there's your set password. So what you can do is in this on change handler, we want to set email equal to e.target.value, right? And then we can do the same thing down here for password. Now, when somebody goes to handle submit, I could actually console log the current value of the email and the password. So my email example.com and then password 123. Sign in, and you can see right here, we managed to pass the values from those fields up into the state of the component. Right? Now, there's another thing that you want to do after submit, which is actually you want to reset that email password. So if you hit submit and it was wrong, you don't want it to stay there. We want to clear those out. So typically once a form is done, you set email blank, right? And then we're also going to set password as an empty string. Let's try that out. So example.com. All right, we'll put some random password in and sign in. But it looks like this didn't change at all, even though we just set it to equal to nothing, right? Let me try to hit sign in again. What happens? Well, look, now it's empty. All right. So we're missing a piece of feedback, and the piece of feedback that we're missing here is the direction from our state back to this input tag. Right. So what we want to have is we want to have what's called a controlled form, such that the values of that form are closed loop with the state of the component. Now the tag, the input tag, is doing a good job of setting this value of the state, but we also want anytime that state gets gets changed, we want it to change the value inside of the input. And that's pretty simple. So there's actually a value tag, and you just set that equal to email in this case. All right, and then here we'll just set the value tag to password. Try this again. Password. Now you can see after I press sign in, they're no longer there. And so that's exactly the kind of behavior that we want here, right? Anybody got any questions? No? All right. I'm going to take this moment. Let's actually style this thing a little bit. So we're going to make let's say the file would be login.module.css. All right. And we'll start off with a login card. Make sure it doesn't have a border. I'm going to give it a margin of 150 pixels for the top and bottom, and then left, right, make it auto. That allows it to self-center. All right, and then my max width will be 500 pixels. And we'll also have to start off a form container. All right, I don't want a border on it either. We'll put a little bit of padding inside. Give it a radius. Background color to white. And add a little bit of a box shadow. So let's say 0, 2, 5, 5, make it like a gray, right? Just a light gray. So remember, we need to import that styles up here, right? And set that equal to the class name. So search some login card, right? And this next one here, this is containing our form, right? We'll make that one the form container. All right, so let's see what that looks like. All right, so we're starting to get somewhere, right? We got our login card. This is our form container. And now we just want to kind of spread out this email password and then make the button look a little bit better. All right, so I'll set the form header. Give it a font size 1.5 EM for relative, right? We'll text align at center. Give it a little bit of padding. That'll come right here, form header. All right, got this guy centered. All right, now we want to style the form. Well, we're going to use display grid. If you guys remember that vehicle card container that we used on the vehicle screen, use the grid. Set our auto flow to row. And then we want to have a little bit of a gap within the elements of our grid. This already helps quite a bit. All right, so you can see the stuff's kind of lined up now. Now what we want to do is we want to stack email on top, allow the form on bottom, stack password on top, and put this input on the bottom as well. Then we're going to take this button and we're going to shrink it down, put it here, left justified. Remember, form fields, we actually put some divs to contain each of our fields, right, with both the label and the input. So those will have a display grid. All right. That needs to be added. So this guy's going to be our form field. We only have 2 fields in this thing. There we go. That's starting to look a little bit better. Now each field has a label and an input. A little bit of a margin at the top, margin at the bottom. As well as a, here, I'm just going to copy and paste this. Make this the form label. Display block makes elements essentially show up on their own line. So none of their siblings will show up on the same line. Like for example, H1, H2, H3 tags tend to be display block. All right, let's add these guys. So this is our form label, right? Here's our form input. Okay, just about there. Now we just want to style the button a little bit. Another class called submit button. I'm going to set it to like a navy blue. So the text to white. Make it bold. It's font weight. Max width at 100 pixels. Do a little bit of padding inside. And then we want to round the corners a little bit. So put a border radius on there. All right. So this isn't showing up. It's not showing up because we have to set the class name still. There we go. All right, so we've got our button, but we want to, this doesn't really look like it's clickable yet, right? Even though it is. And if you notice I'm trying to submit it and now I'm getting this indication. We didn't get that. We didn't notice that before, but it's because I never tried to submit it with an empty form. And what this is it's that required tag that we saw in this input here. So before we finish up the styles, I want to add a hover feature. So I'm trying to recall the name here, but there's a set of CSS actions that you can target for context-specific things that happen to an element. And one of the ones is called hover. And what that is it applies specific styles for when you're hovering on top of an element. So we can actually change the cursor. We can make that into a pointer. And then just to show really that we're over top of it, I'm going to change the background to a lighter blue. All right. So see if that works. All right, there we go. So that gives kind of an indication here that we can click on this button. All right.
But that only works if you're on desktop. It doesn't work on mobile, does it? 'Cause you can't really hover when you're on mobile.
Unfortunately not. And
Accessibility things you think about when you do front end design and stuff like that.
when there's one other thing. I mean, speaking of mobile, if we open this up, it can be a little bit. Actually, you know what? This actually looks pretty good. I was gonna say we could change this margin top for a smaller screen size, but I think we're all right. All right. So we now have a login page. We've managed to access the fields, right, within the state of our component, but we haven't actually hooked this thing up to the backend or in order to do a login, right? So the next thing that we got to do is bring in our API library, right? If we come down here to utils, we've got a GET request, but what we need at this point is a post, right? So I can make a post here, change the method. And one thing I want to change is, and add both to both of these, if res.status happens to be at or above 400, so those are your error statuses for HTTP, I want to go ahead and just throw the res. That way I can detect whether or not this request has failed. All right, so we're going to use this post. All right. If we look back at vehicles, you guys remember we use this to do our get, right? API.get. So we can use the same kind of pattern to do a post, but there's something we're missing here for this post, right? We got a route, but what we need to be able to do is we also need to be able to post a body. That's going to come through as a JSON payload. All right. Now what we want to do is once the user submits, we want to send that to our backend. So let's go ahead and let's try this. I'm going to say API.post. The route, anybody remembers, let's look at cloud here. What's the route called? From the index.js. This is our backend code.
For that, right?
I'm sorry?
Probably we had API documents for that.
I know.
Weren't you guys supposed to do that for homework or something? Like add a bunch of the API routes for that and all the documents for the open API stuff?
The return schemas. So it's pretty simple. It's just a / login, right? If we look again in here, we can see it's expecting an email and a password on the request body. All right, so that's the structure that we need to adhere to when we go to try to log in. It's going to be / login, and then our body is going to be email and password, right? And then let's just say then, and let's look at the res here. We'll also catch in case it throws something, right? I'll just say there was an error. I'll log the error. Right, and what we want to do here is we want to wait until the response comes back in order to set the email and password, right? In order to reset it. We'll also do the same thing if it fails. So let's check this out. So let's say example at example.com, password. All right, so there was a login error. The status was, this is our URL, it tried to go to login, and it got a 401. If anybody remembers what 401 is unauthorized. We got our status text back right here. All right. Now, if anybody remembers the user that we actually set up, which is set up in the database, the name was, you can see here, Lauren Ipsum. Our password, lauren.ipsum@example.com, and then, our email, lauren.ipsum@example.com, and our password is laurenipsum123. Let's give that one a shot. All right, lauren.ipsum@example.com, laurenipsum123. Oh, there we go. All right, so we've got a token, right? This is the standard response that came back from the login route. We know the epoch times or the epoch timestamp when this expires, as well as all kinds of user infos. We've got when they were created, the email, first, last name, last time the record was updated, as well as the user UID. All right. So now that we've got that information, we actually need to be able to store it somewhere. Right? And this component isn't going to be using the other components as props. So we don't have that as an option right now, at least not with the way we're architecting it. What we can use is now we can use context. All right. So inside of a front end, I'm going to make another folder here. Just call it context. And this, we're going to set up, at the moment, we're going to set up two different types of context. So I'm going to set up an auth context, right? And this is itself, it's another React component. So we need to import React from React, all right? And we're just going to call this a auth context provider. It gets a set of props. I'll just return a div at the moment. All right. We want to export that one by default. Now what React comes with is it comes with a feature called create context. All right. And what we can do, we've got two different things that we need here. We need to create a context provider, which we use to wrap the different components that we want to provide that type of context to. And we also need to be able to create the context itself. So we can export this context here. Right. So that can be imported directly from the components that are going to consume the context. And then when we return, what we actually return here is this auth context dot provider. But we actually do need to provide something. So what we'll do is we're going to use React's useState to provide some actual state for this context to provide. Now, what kind of state do we need for context? So I'm going to set up two different things here. One, just a nice simple flag is authenticated, and a set is authenticated. We'll default that to false for use state. And then another one will be a token. Right? I'll just set that to an empty string at the moment. And then when we provide this, this actually gets provided through the attribute on auth context.provider called value. So this is what can be passed down and consumed through this context. And you can essentially import this from any of the components that are contained within your context provider. Right? So I'm going to pass down is authenticated. Set is authenticated, token, and set token. All right, so any of our consumers can access these different properties. Now, this isn't the only one we want. We're going to make another context and call it the user context.
JC, can you just explain what you mean by context? I kind of completely understood what you said, that we need to store the information. And then you started talking about context, and I'm just not clear as to what this is.
It'll become a little bit more clear as we go, but it's context
okay.
in the way that you're used to really thinking about context, right? Like if you can have a theme context, for example, right? So maybe you have a particular component that actually chooses the styles that it goes with based on if you're like on a light theme or a dark theme, you know? And those kind of things aren't necessarily hierarchical, right? You don't, if you want to be able to put a particular component in a particular context, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of its siblings or all of its children need to be in that same context, right? So it's a way of us being able to, in a more surgical manner, define what kind of data gets shared between what components. right? And you're saying, all right, in this case, we have a auth context and a user context. And what we'll do is any of the components that need to have access to that kind of data, right, will get put within a provider for those contexts, right? Now, later on, towards the end, I'm going to create a vehicle context, right? So you can imagine, for example, a login screen is going to want to have access to the auth context because it has the ability to go and attempt to log in and actually set the token, right? But should you give the login screen access to your vehicle context if you've stored vehicle data in there? Not necessarily, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
And so it allows you to kind of pinpoint exactly where you want to inject these different pieces of data, right? And control it from a scope perspective as well. And so once I start wrapping some components with these contexts, at first we're going to wrap everything with this auth and the user context, and the differentiator won't be quite so clear, other than the fact that it's just really convenient to be able to import and use context from within the other components. Otherwise, you'd have to pass. You know, if you have a component that's all the way at the bottom of your component tree and you need to access something, if you didn't have context, and we're not using some other libraries, for example, like Redux, you would have to just pass it through props all the way down, right? Whereas some of the parent components don't even need to know perhaps that piece of data, that flag, whatever it may be. And then with context, it just allows you to kind of skip over the rest of the components and access that data directly from where you want. I think, and to me, it really does feel like you're hooking right into the data at that point. So the hook starts to make sense, especially when you see, you'll see a use context hook that we'll use in the other components that are actually going to use the context, depending on what the context is.
The way I look at it is you have the document object model is a tree, right? That is actually a the structure of it, right? It is a tree, where you have a node and then you have subnodes, and underneath those they have nodes, right? That's a tree data structure. Now imagine that, of this tree, let's say you have like a tree with 3 branches and some subchildren, right? Some other leaves underneath these branches. And the one of the leaves on this tree over on the left, right, of the 3 needs some information, the same information as leaves that are 5 layers down in the tree, right? 5 nodes down. The context basically gives you this, the way I think of it, it gives you sort of an overarching umbrella, or more kind of it's like it's a sidecar. It's kind of a run along sort of thing to the tree. It's a wrapper for the entire tree, so that what you can do is, based on your leaves, right, in your tree, when you're working with them, our components, right, in this case, like our vehicle card or those types of things, can basically reach out into that wrapper and grab context, because that wrapper is the context, right? And so that's what JC's doing here. In this sense, auth is a very abstract thing. It's not a vehicle or vehicle data, but there's auth data, right? A token, things that you need. So any of the leaves at any point, as long as they're provided a hook, in this case the auth context, any component leaf can reach out into it and then grab the data that it needs and then use it inside of that component. Otherwise, if we didn't have this concept of this wrapper context, we would have had to actually pass all of that data into every single leaf. And of course, it would need to be passed through all the parent leaves also. And most of those parent leaves, right, didn't even need to know any of that kind of stuff, right? And so that's really what it comes down to, is viewing the document object model and your structures as a tree, and what data needs to be shared between them. And that's where the context really comes in. And I'm sure JC will get to it at the end when he starts talking about dispatching, dispatch events and things. That actually comes back to JavaScript and some of the limitations and the single threadedness of the actual JavaScript engine. We won't go into that too much right now, because I'm sure I don't want to derail this, but That's really the way I look at it, and how context to me kind of makes sense as I go and I kind of structure and architect how I put these things together.
So is this kind of like a global define in C with an accessor function to it?
It kind of is, yes. It's kind of a global define, something that's available to everyone. Uh, I think that the difference in my mind to a global access like in C is that in C, any function can get it, but you do have some control over who gets the context in this based on where you put your provider. So if you can wrap your provider over just a subset of leaves. Whereas if you define your C, in C, you define your global variable, everyone's got it, and it's kind of dangerous. So in that sense, we have a little bit more control over it. Not to mention the fact that providers can also be functions. You can now pass functions too, which is a very powerful thing, where you can't necessarily do that with C. Uh, I tell lies. You can. There are function pointers in C, but you really don't really think of it in that way, right? You think of it as passing around memory references, whereas in this, we're actually passing around this context, which is kind of a global wrapper to everything. Don't think of it as global though. That's where that's why I kind of want to make a differentiation. Don't think of context as global. Think of it as a provider to the different places in your tree. If you think about it globally, then you actually fall into traps in terms of architecting, and it ends up it has implications on performance and how things get rendered and re-rendered in the DOM. So if you end up providing your context to every single leaf would need to be re-rendered if any of the data inside that context were to be updated. So that's one of the things. So don't think of it in terms of this is global, so I'm just going to give everything, give everything, and put everything in a single context. You don't want to do that. You want to architect it so you split it out into logical ways so that you're not constantly causing all of your components to re-render when they don't need to, right? Because they don't need all that data. So that's why I want to differentiate between a global and what context is really meant for and why it's structured this way. It looks more complicated. At first, you might say, wow, this looks way more common than it should be. Why can't I just make a global variable, global store? Well, you can, but it has implications on performance and re-rendering in the virtual DOM.
Right, because everything that consumes that context, right? Actually, everything that's contained within the provider, if you just made one big provider for your entire tree, every time that state for that context changes, so in our case, we've got a token, for example. If that token ever changed, you could have components that don't even care about the token getting re-rendered. It's obviously not something that's efficient.
But the login was like a leaf, right? It's like one of the, here's the login authentication.
The login screen, the component is a leaf. Yeah.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah. And then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, so now I'm gonna provide this context, and it's not necessarily global, but it is the how I'm going to store the information context.
Yeah.
So that it essentially is setting that parameter that says, okay, you've got this login screen, which is your leaf. Now I'm going to go ahead and set a context around it so that I'm going to tell the system how to deal with the information that you've been given in this leaf, but I want it in a context so that it's more broadly can be accessed.
Yeah, and maybe. So let me restate it in the way I think of it, and we may be saying the same thing. Well, the way I think of it is, you are right that we have the login, which is a leaf, and there's functionality that occurs in the login, meaning you hit that submit button, it's going to go and check with the server and return a valid token if the credentials are correct. At that point, you hook back into your context and say, all right, here's a token that I got as a leaf. Shove this into the context for other components, other leaves to use later. So that's kind of, so maybe we were saying the same thing, but that's kind of how I think of it, and that's really where JC I liked what he said there, and he said that's where it becomes a hook, because what you're doing is you're hooking in, right? And so you can think of a hook hooking into the context, and hooking in and doing it, and then other hooks hooking in and getting data that it needs, but only the data that it needs.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, once we start consuming the context, you'll really feel like it legitimately the name serves it well, because it is like a hook. You're just hooking into that context and getting what you need. All right. And this graphic is kind of to show essentially the difference between providing props through components, right, versus having your context. So you can wrap everything in your context. I mean, it also just creates unnecessary code, because anytime that you want to add something to this child component, now you have to go and update everything above it all the way to the root of your data, right? So you can see how this is in not just terms of performance, but in terms of code maintainability, this is a nightmare, right? All right. So we've got these two different contexts. We gotta update this user context now, right? So this is going to be our user context provider. And then this one only actually needs one piece of state, and that's going to be our user. Set its default to 0, user, and then set user. All right. Set this guy to be user context provider. All right. And now what we need to do is we need to actually bring these up into the tree so that we can start providing them. Now, like I mentioned, the auth and the user context, these are both going to be provided to everything. All right, we also want our auth context. Recall we exported the providers, not necessarily the context by default, right? I want you to notice in these files, we actually export two things. We export the context and we export the provider. All right. And you'll see how we import the context in another, once we go to consume it. So here underneath of app, I can provide the auth context, right? That just needs to wrap everything down here. And we also want to put in the user context. And you could ask, why didn't I just put them both in the same provider? If you wanted to, you could. It's just, you sort of want to try to keep your context, depending upon your style. You could try to go with a global context, but it's nice to be able to have a particular purpose for each context. That way that you can target the components that you want, so that you're not doing unnecessary renders in the future. So, but for the time being, we're going to wrap everything in the auth and the user context. And that means that all of these child components, right? You remember the children, props.children, all of these child components can access that. Now, speaking of that, there is something I forgot. When we come in here, we need to render our children. So I'm going to say props.children. Right? Just like we did with that layout, we've got to do that with the providers.
Got to render those leaves, right?
Yeah. Otherwise they'd never show up. You'd see a blank screen. Right? So we've got those set up. Now what we can do is we can come back in here to login, and we can import that context. So grab the user context. In this case, notice the import's different. I'm destructuring and I'm actually grabbing the user context directly. Same thing for the auth context. Okay. And then at the top of the screen here, we want to use what's called the use context hook. So here's where you're going to see it actually hooking in, and it's going to look really similar to our use state at the moment. But instead of destructuring as an array, we're actually going to destructure as an object. So here's our user context. And now we've got two things that we passed in for the user context. We've got user and set user. We actually only need, and we only want the set user. All right. And then for the auth context, we're going to grab the set. It was set is authenticated. And we'll also grab the set token. All right.
Now
So you can imagine here.
those are just functions, right? That are from that provider. That's going to allow us to hook in and hook back out to the context and set that data store in that context. Those are just functions.
Does that make sense, guys? So these pieces of context, this user context and the auth context, are actually hooked into the state that's in the auth and user context providers. And then this is allowing us to inject that state, hook into that state essentially from any component that's within one of these providers on the tree, right? So if we come back to our tree, this is our overall tree, right? We've got our providers here. That login component's underneath the tree. So it has access to both auth and user context. So I'm not grabbing out props. I'm actually able to come in here on this login component, use my use context hook, and then grab it directly off of that without having to deal with all of the parent components of login, having to pass this kind of stuff down through props like we did with that vehicles to vehicle card. So now that we have access to this, what we want to do is we actually want to set it once we've got a successful login. So if this login is successful, you remember off that res we can set the user, right? It'll be res.user. We can set our token, res.token, right? And we can also say it is authenticated and just set that to true. So that's good and all, right? We manage to log in, we can store that on it, but usually after you log in, you actually do get redirected somewhere. So what we need to do, we're going to use something called history. That's available from React Router DOM, which is the same package that we use to set up this switch router here, right? Come up top, we've got React Router DOM that sets up all of our different routes. Now, it also has a hook called use history. Right, so we can, once this component comes in, we can actually create a reference to history. And what this will allow us to do is actually move to a different, one of those other routes on the switch. Okay, so I'll say history.push, and we'll go to home, right?
Now here's a cool little thing that's happening. That use history, did you know that's just a provider? We just didn't call it that in that React router stuff. That's what it's doing, is it's actually defining a provider and managing that flow in that provider. And so when you say that use history, that all that use history is actually a context. And it's the context of where you are in that tree, in your DOM tree. So you can move between, well, the switch there. And that browser router, that higher order component that's on JC's line 16 there, is the same as, implemented the same as auth context and user context provider. It just isn't called a provider, but it really actually is. So you're starting to see the patterns start to come out, right? We actually are all doing the same stuff. It may look a little bit like magic, but really not. Going back to last week when we actually implemented like set state and use state and the use MQTT and all that kind of stuff, we were just making hooks, and then we were actually making versions of context and providers.
Yeah, none of this would work if it wasn't all contained within the browser router. So what's going to happen now that if you get a successful login, history push, if we go to home, what do you guys think is going to happen after a login?
It should reroute you to the home page, right?
Exactly. So let's try it out. First off, it looks like we've got an error. And so this has already been declared. What's that, an app? So this guy needs to be user. All right, let's try. So it's Lauren Ipsum, right? 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, so we logged in. All right. And one thing I want to do is I want to show you guys, we still have access to that data that we just set. So the user information, right? Now I'll get rid of this console log. I was logging the response from the login. And now let's go into the home page. We know the home page is within the provider, right? So let's check out the user context within the home page. So we can import that. We can use context, right? And we can hook into that right here. Const user, use context, right? And grab the user context. Now I'll set up a console log. We'll say we're home. And I'll console log this user.
Do us one better, JC. Why don't you say welcome home, comma, the name of the user?
And it's erroring out on me. You guys got any idea why? It's because we're mixing two different things here. Notice the class. Hooks go hand in hand with functional components, right? So we just need to write this guy as a functional component real quick. Allow this thing to have props, right? It doesn't have functional components instead of rendering, it's just what they return. Right, now we can use our hooks. You can use context with class components, but the API is different. You don't actually use the hooks. So hooks and functional components go hand in hand, right? And we're leaning much more heavily towards functional components because it eliminates a lot of boilerplate, and it is more or less the latest and greatest in terms of React practices. So now we've got home, use context. Let's check it out. I'll go back to login. Right, add our lorem ipsum. There you go. Just like BJ said, welcome home, lorem. And we couldn't have done that before without actually being able to store that user info there on the context. So we've managed to set up a login page, right? We got the layout separated, and we've hooked into context. We can store login credentials and whatnot, but we do seem to have a little bit of a problem here. For example, I'm gonna refresh the page. If you look, that goes away. So we don't have that information anymore, which means we don't actually have our user information. If I type user, it's blank, right? Which means I also don't have the token anymore, but I can get into this page. Same thing for vehicles, right? I can access all these vehicles still. What we want is we want this system to kick us back to login unless we are authenticated, unless we actually have the credentials, right? So we need to actually wrap all of these components, these routes here, our blank, our home, and our vehicles. What we want to do is we want to create a private route component that doesn't allow us to access these pages unless we are authenticated. So let's just save our progress real quick. Now I'm making these commits along the way. If you guys look at the weekly resources when we're done, you actually be able to look at these commits in the different steps and see what the code looked like at the different levels here. Right? So what have we done? We just added context and a login page. So the next thing I'm going to make here, we're gonna wrap this route and we're gonna make a private route component. So I'm just going to do that inside a lib. Private route. I'm going to make something called a private route here. Just like the rest, we need to import React. Call it private route. Have props. I'll just return a div for now. And export this as default. Okay. So this is sort of like a special version of those routes because that switch in our app, it can only accept things essentially that are routes, right? And so we need to import route from React Router DOM. All right. And I intend on using this inside of those providers. So we're going to get access to the auth context. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and import the auth context. All right. Remember, we can grab that is authenticated here. So what we want to do is we only want to actually return a route if this thing's authenticated. So we can do this here. Say is authenticated. We'll go ahead and return a route. And if it's not, we want to do something else. Right? There's a couple things that we got to do. This, you guys remember seeing children off of props? We want to be able to render the children, but we also want to be able to grab other props that are passed into this private route. We want to pass them as props to the route that we're going to return. So I'm going to spread those in here into the route as props, right? So what we're doing here, instead of accessing the props directly, we're just passing them through. Whatever gets passed in as props for private route is going to get passed in as props for route. And what we'll do is we'll actually render the children. So all this is doing here is it's using the authentication context to either allow us to pass that route back if you're authenticated, but if you're not, it'll just pass something else back. So let's actually see this thing in action a little bit. All right, so instead of this here, we use private route, right? We want the home, and we want our vehicles pages to be contained within a private route. So if I refresh, oh, I just see something else, right? It doesn't actually return that component if you're not authenticated, but let's go into login. We'll try to come in here through login. All right, now you actually can see it. You can see these different components because we are authenticated, right? But if I refresh, which is going to kill my context at the moment, right? I'm going to lose that is authenticated, and now it doesn't return it. Now, what we really want to do, we don't want to just say something else or return, you know, hey, you're not authenticated anymore. Really, we should just send them back to the login page, right? And conveniently, if we look at the React Router DOM documentation, it has something called a redirect. All right. So instead of passing back something else, we can pass back a redirect. And I'm going to provide this too. So you get to say where you want to redirect to. Right? So we want to tell it to go to the login screen, right? Let's just do that. All right, so every time you refresh, if I lose my credentials by refreshing here, I should end up getting kicked back into login. But it's actually kind of nice. Like, for example, if you got a link to come to this site and you were trying to access a particular page, you'd like to get sent back to that site. And what we can do is we can encode that information up here in the URL. So that comes in on a search parameter. Now this is something that comes, this URL search params. This comes straight from the browser here. Now I'm gonna put a handful of stuff in here. This has to do with, essentially we're gonna URL encode this because some of your routes that you may have been trying to go to, they could have been, they could have actual forward slashes in them. And you can't just simply save that as a query parameter. You'll see what I mean here in a moment. Now you may be asking, what's all this stuff? Props, location search, props, location path name, props, location path name. If you guys remember, back when we set up the HTML, the front end basic, we actually used that information to do our simulation of what was going on with the switch. So these props.location, this is essentially like the windows.location that we had before, the web API, so that you can access what was in that URL, right? And we just want to take this guy here and then convert it to a string. Right, so this is going to get saved in the as a query parameter here. I'll show you the difference. So now that we got redirected, you can see we went to login. There.
I mean, keep in mind, we have two sets of URLs, right? We have front-end URLs, like /login and /home, and then we also have back-end URLs, which are actually two different servers, if you think about it. And more specifically, the front-end URLs are actually more virtual because they're not actually switching pages, right? Because it's a single-page app. It's more, we do that in order to allow for it to look like we're switching pages, but really we're not. We're managing as a single app.
Right, and so we need a way of keeping track of what's going on up here in the URL, right? Where virtually the user's intending to go on our website. Now, if let's say that you're not authenticated, but you want to come to this page, and you just copy and paste this link into your address bar, right? So I'm going to copy and paste this in, and I'm just going to hit enter. If you look there, in the URL now, there's this 2. So what it did was it knew where I wanted to go when I initially went to the page, but it knows that I'm not authenticated, right? So what we can do is we can actually use this information initially and as part of our login process. So instead of just sending them directly to home, because we don't know after a successful login that that's where they wanted to go, we can take advantage of that query parameter if it exists and send them to the page they initially wanted to land on, right? So we'll use that same tool. I'll just call this, this is gonna be your redirect. We'll use this URL search params. Just like before, it coming off window location, right? And we wanna get that 2 field here, right? You can see it's getting saved on a query parameter called 2. And this will convert the redirect to exactly the string we want to go to. Now, if it's not there, all right, I'll just say this is a let, and then redirect is going to equal itself if it exists. And if not, we'll just send it to home. All right. And so now we'll push to wherever that redirect is set to. So now if we log in, because remember it was sending us to home before. Now if we log in, it'll send us straight to vehicles, which is what we were trying to access. Does that make sense, everybody?
So that either means no, it makes no sense at all whatsoever. We're just going to remain silent so that he doesn't pick on us. Or
It does.
Yes.
It makes sense.
all right.
Yes.
All right. So we managed to actually we've got this thing locked down now, right? You can see we kind of got our little wall in place that sets the rest of our app up such that you can't get in here unless you actually know the credentials. You know, I can try to type in vehicles all I want. It's going to send me back. I can try to type home in. It's not going to let me in. But what's frustrating right now is every time I log in, and I refresh, I'm getting kicked out, and I don't want that to happen, right? I logged in. I should be able to refresh the page without getting kicked out of my application. How do you do that? Well, we're gonna take advantage of something called local storage in our browser, and that's something that's actually available right here in the console. If you look at local storage, right, you can get in here and you can see some stuff that I already did. I've already got some local storage that was saved here from running this earlier, right? So what we can do is we can set up hooks into our local storage within the providers, right? So we're going to come back. You guys remember the use effect from last week? All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to set up a use effect such that anytime these are changed, we end up saving that information into the local storage. All right, so I'll set up a use effect here. And this will be if is authenticated or token ever change. I'm just going to make a variable call auth context here and store the current value of is authenticated as well as token. and then I'll call local storage. I can access this directly because this is running this is available right there via the web API in the browser, right? And then I can call what the storage is actually just a set of key value pairs. So for your key, you have to provide a string, and we'll just call it auth context, all right? And then the value also has to be a string. So we can't just put this, we can't put this object in there directly, but we can stringify it. So I'll just call JSON stringify and pass the auth context in. All right. And what that does is anytime these two values change, right, it will actually save those to local storage. And if you can see what those are saved as, if you come over here to application, you look under storage, local storage, you can see your key value pairs. So I've got this auth context. You can see what was last saved, right? Now, not only do we want to save it, we actually want to initialize with it, right? When this thing initializes, right now it's initializing with false for authenticated and an empty string for token. So instead of that, what we can do is pass a function in that gets called to initialize it. And I'll say let local data, grab this off of local storage, and we want to grab the auth context, right? And then I'll say local data. If it does exist, if this key doesn't exist, that get item will just return on all. So if it does exist, we want to parse the JSON. Otherwise, I'm going to return an object that has is authenticated set to false. And then I return local data that is authenticated, right? So what I'm saying here is if the context is there, I want to grab is authenticated out of it like this, right? I'm going to parse it and then grab that field. And if not, I just pass back an object that already has that field set to false. That's if the local search is cleared out or anything, right? And then we can do the exact same thing here for our token. So it's also just getting stored inside of that auth context key, right? And then instead of is authenticated, I'll pass in token. Token is just going to be an empty string. And then I don't want is authenticated off of local data, I want token. All right. So now, if we come and we log in, I sign in here, you can see that is authenticated got saved in the local storage. And let's see if I can refresh. There we go. We can refresh, right? Come to home. Now, if you notice, I refreshed, that username's not there, right? Why is that? It's because we need to add this logic in here to our user context as well, right? So, I mean, I'm just gonna copy and paste some of this stuff in since it's not that far removed. We need to grab our use effect. And then instead of auth context, this is gonna be our user context that we're grabbing from, right? This is our user and set user. Get rid of this. And we want to pass back user. Our initial value is an empty object. And then the only thing we need to monitor for the user context is the user value for the state, right? And I'll just call this thing user context. And the only thing we need to store in there is also user. All right. So essentially what we're doing here, we just hooked into our local storage in the browser, and we're just storing everything that has to do with our auth and our user context as key value pairs inside of local storage in the browser. So if it finds them, it will use the values that it sees there, and if it does not find them, it will just go with these defaults, which are like an empty object, in this case, false for is authenticated, and an empty string for a token, right? So now if we go back, we need to go back to the login page. All right. We're signing in. We got our vehicles. You can see Lorem's there, right? And now before, when I refreshed, that Lorem went away. No, it's still there, right? Because we stored that inside of our local storage. All right. Let's save this progress here. So say we add private route and local storage context. All right. So you might have a question here. Okay, we can log in, you know, I know I'm behind a shield and whatnot. I got this stored in context. What if I want to get rid of my data? Like, what if I want to log out? We need a way to log out, right? So that's simple enough. We just need to write the logic here. Let's add an account page so that we can see kind of who we're logged in as, other than just this home greeting, right? So what I'm going to do here, under screens, we'll add an account.
Just have a quick question. So is a local storage is a temporary storage, or it will be there on the computer forever?
It'll be there as long as it doesn't get cleared out. So I don't know what the TTL is for the
And
local
that
storage.
is there a security threat if it is there?
Yeah.
If somebody uses some
Yeah.
somewhere they're using a browser, some in a non-secure or non-owned or non-personal system, say a browsing center, then they leave the information there on the public server, right? Browser, right?
Right. No, that's a really good point, Arif. And in fact, if you look around, there's a lot of articles about that say that are titled "Do not store tokens in local storage," and we're doing that right here. The reason is because there's a couple of different ways to store these things, and we'll talk about it since you asked. The Right now, we're you actually using local storage. Local storage is perpetual. It will always be there as long as your browser is there, and you don't affect it. The thing is, with local storage, local storage is still scoped to the domain, the front end domain. And you'll notice here in this application tab in your dev tools that only the site that is localhost 5000 vehicles can access the scope of that local storage. So google.com couldn't read your local storage and get your token for your website. So there is a security shield there for that. Um, the reason that people say that local storage is insecure is because if you have malicious JavaScript code, like let's say that one of those lovely browser plugins that Justin has on his computer up there in the top right, it's got a number of different things. You have, what do you got up there, Justin? You got a React plugin, you've got a Google Drive plugin, you got some. So let's say he accidentally or didn't know or something like that got infected with some bad JavaScript. Technically, right now, those plugins, those browser plugins, have access to the JavaScript and the local storage on this page because he gave those browser plugins access to do things on this page. Particularly like the one I like is that color picker, right? So this little color picker, if you pick it, if you click on it, you can pick. You could just go over and then pick a color on it, and it'll tell you what the hex code is on a website. So really useful for getting hex code. Like if you see a color you like, and you can go and use it and all that kind of stuff. It'll give you. But the problem is, so someone coded this, but in order to do that, he gave that browser plugin access to this domain, specifically localhost 5000 vehicles. And so if there's a malicious code running in one of those browser plugins, which you never know, they can easily go and grab tokens, cookies, and those types of things. So what's the alternative? Like if we don't want to use local storage, honestly, guys, I'm okay with local storage. I think it's a pretty low risk. And if you are that concerned about it, you can always do rolling tokens and all those different things. There are strategies to get around it. We typically use local storage, and the reason is because the alternative is using cookies. And the issue with cookies is they're really only supported by browsers. Whereas a local storage, when we talk about native application development, which we'll talk about in a couple weeks, that token, there's an async secure storage on native platforms that you can use. And so it allows us to share code and strategies if you use local storage a lot better. I don't deem the risk of local storage great enough for the inconvenience and maintenance cost of managing two different authentication methods, which actually ends up affecting both the server and the client. It just doesn't make sense to me. To finish out this thought, the idea, the alternative, of course, is cookies. Using browser cookie. And you hear about this all the time, right? Privacy is, oh, accept cookies, all this crap. Cookies are basically just things like local storage, key value pairs that are stored in your browser or server side. And so you can use server side cookies where the server actually sets cookies and has a session with your browser. And then you can basically, you as a browser can't access those server side cookies, but only the server can. That makes that ultimately safe, right? Because it's basically the server saying, all right, I'm giving you access to, I'm giving you a token, but I'm the one keeping track of it, right? If you give it client side, now client side cookies can be scoped, but a lot of people don't use cookies correctly. And really, the power of cookies from an advertising perspective is to make them public so that any site can see any of your cookies so it can be tracked, right? So they can track you around to see where you've been and what other cookies you have. And so, they can do all of these different strategies. So that's kind of the difference between the two. The problem with the server-side cookies is that they're not as flexible on all the other platforms that we have to support. All the native stuff, mobile devices, everything. It's much easier to pass around these JWT tokens and then store it in local storage, which has an analogous sort of implementation on most other platforms that we would implement on. So that's kind of the down low, I guess, of what local storage is. And is it a security risk? Yes, because you can always open up someone's browser and look, but you can't really go in and scrape this from other websites because they are scoped and there's a lot of browser security around not allowing that. Everything's sandboxed.
One to add to that, the token itself also has an expiration.
That's a good point. Yeah, we do expire the JWT token. So in some sense, that token will become, even if it stays in the browser that way, it expires itself. The thing with local storage, you cannot set a TTL, right, a time to live on it to where it just disappears. In cookies, you can, so that a cookie will disappear after a certain amount of time. So that is one downside of local storage.
Yeah, and with the way that we're storing it here, I mean, it would have to know, or there'd have to be some kind of set convention as to what field name you give the token, right? Like I could just as well as called this token field Fred if I wanted to, and if I knew that I was going to search on that key, I would know that there's a JWT token stored there, right?
So JC, before you do the logout page, could we take a 5-minute break?
Absolutely.
You may not. We're going to power through.
Okay, that's fine.
Go take your 5-minute break, guys.
All right. Yeah, we'll take a 5-minute break. I'll see everybody back here.
So Clayton, I got that to work. Hijacking Duke term with the MQTT socket.
Okay.
So we can do that tomorrow if you want.
All right.
Look at it.
Did you get it, see what the latency is on that?
No, I didn't do that. I just made sure that it built and everything.
But it did use it though.
It did use it, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna need your experience on, actually wrapping it into it. But I was able to. I just used the REPL. I didn't actually code it in, but I used the REPL to emulate the socket commands in MQTT. And
Okay.
I was able to actually hijack it with a Duke term on the socket.
Okay. Yeah, I think that that works. And I was just looking, there's a WebSockets, the WebSocket client's not built into this. But there is, did you see that the MQTT simple and MQTT robust, which is built in already? So that's probably what we want to use.
Oh, there's a built-in MQTT simple?
Yeah, there's a built-in MQTT simple and MQTT robust, so it's probably very similar.
Oh,
That
geez.
you
That
probably
may be what
use.
I'm using.
What's that?
That may be what I'm using. I may have
You
unnecessary
know,
clip.
it's a really confusing.
Yeah, the community's not that put together.
Yeah, so you know, there's a lot of people developing and using modules, and then they slowly get integrated, and Damien will take them and put them into
The core.
you know, they become part of the official thing. So there's going to be a lot of developers out there, and then he'll take it and make it work. But yeah, so there is stuff in there, and then it will take a little while before the documentation catches up with what's actually available in there.
I mean, we
So
can use that core, but I'm thinking, I mean, we could just use this thing I pulled off because it's really simple. I mean,
yeah, either way, I think it's probably the same thing.
it
So
probably,
it's probably already there, and once we get a hold of the socket itself, then that's what we can
mhm,
use. Yep.
sounds good. Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised. So, how about that async? The async IO, there is a U async IO in the core MicroPython, which I assume is supported by ESP32, right?
No, I don't think it. I'm okay. So if you're on your device and you type help parentheses single quote modules single quote in parentheses, it'll give you a list of what's available in that ESP32 build.
Okay, yeah.
So
REPL is available, but
yeah, so there's the UMQTT, you know, the micro MQTT robust and the micro MQTT simple. And so we'll have to find some docs on that, but I would imagine it's probably the same or very, very similar to what you're looking at.
yeah.
And we can just use the dupe term on the socket, because the socket is an IO object that has all those functions in it. There's only two functions that it has to have, and it does have them.
So we could just modify those
Yep,
and go. All right, cool.
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Or you know, copy and duplicate, because the MQTT simple is going to be really easy to do. I mean,
Yeah, I guess the MQT simple just doesn't do auto reconnect, but the robust does. That's the only difference.
okay, well, either one.
Yeah.
Either one. We would just have to make sure we dumped the. You just have to kill the dupe term, and then restart it on the new one.
Cool.
So
Yeah, no, this one actually looks a lot nicer. Um, I'm looking at the code here, although this is strange. Import simple, but there's no actual simple. Huh. Okay. Yeah, I'll read a little bit more about this. Looks like it's the same code. Yeah, it's the same code. think we're ready, JC.
Everybody's here? All right. So let's get to making an account page then. So we got our account folder under screens. I'll make an account.js. Just like the rest of them, import React. All right. Let's return a div here. Make a h2, call this user account. We'll start a unordered list. First list item will have the first name. The last name for the user, provide the email, as well as when the account was created. Right? And then underneath of that, we also want to have a button for logging out, right? Let's call this log out. We got to export this guy. Let's bring this up into the app here. We want to import this new page, call it the account page. And we'll put it right after vehicles here. Right, put it in the same layout as the rest. We open our site back up. We got our vehicles. We got our home page. We'd have to go directly here to account to be able to find it. But what we want to do is we actually want to add this up to our navigation bar, right? I want to implement this logout button. So we need to go back to our nav bar and add another item here. We want to link this to account. We'll just set the label as account as well. All right, now we got account here. We can come back to our vehicles page, home page, and account. Now what we need to do to be able to actually resolve all of this is we want to go ahead and bring in the user context, right? So we can have the user information. So in here, remember we want to use the use context hook, right? And we want to import user context. User context there. And then I'll go ahead and grab the user information. Right, and then we just spell it right out. User.first name, user.last name, user.email, as well as user.created. All right, so we've got all this info. Before we go any further, let's go ahead and style this up a little bit too.
Now, why wouldn't you want the logout on the navigate button rather than on the account? Like, why would you want it on the account page rather than up on the nav bar?
You want people Beth Ann? You want to make it
Pardon?
you want to make it as hard as possible for someone to leave your site. You don't want them logging out.
Ah, okay, sure, okay.
No, it's a user experience decision.
Okay.
Typically,
Yeah.
so Beth Ann, you're probably used to logging out of things every time you leave a website. for those of us normal people, we typically don't log out every time. In fact, we want the convenience of keeping that token in this local storage. So when I go back, it's going to log me in automatically, so I don't have to re-enter username and password every time. So it's a pretty rare thing you would use the logout button, which is why you shove it into a place that's a little less common to look.
Yeah, I live in Hobbiton, so I'm live in a different world. Yep.
Yeah, it's okay. You're Canadian.
Hey,
Yeah, I mean, you can, and also nothing's preventing you from, like, I mean, if you wanted to put a button up here or a tag and just have literally like a logout directly right there, you could. It's just a matter of style, how you want to do your page layout, everything else, right? Yeah, we could spend. I'm sure we could spend a lot of time discussing all of the details about UI and UX design.
Sign up for the next boot camp. We'll put one on for you. UI, UX. It'll be
No,
acceptable.
that was a good explanation. You don't want to make it easy for people. I get it.
No,
That's,
that,
you don't have to get any further than that.
that's not actually the real reason, but it sounded good at the time.
Yeah, I think the thing that you used to is just kind of seeing your avatar up here in the top right, right? You can click it and log out directly. It's just a matter of essentially how many different components, how many effects that we would want to have to build into this at the moment.
But all you'd have to do is stick it on your nav bar if that's really what you wanted to do. So it's not actually that difficult to do.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, it's just a
Yeah.
matter of the style where you want to put it.
Yeah, especially because of the way you've laid it out. So it's just a matter of going in there and, yep, I got it.
You just gotta, if you do that, you just gotta provide your auth context to your navbar component, right?
Exactly. Which we have because our nav bar is contained in our layout component, right? All right. So let's style this guy up a little bit. Make an account card. You know what? I'm gonna borrow some of the styles from here. Just speed this up a little bit. Give it 25. 25 here. Call this account card. We don't need a form container, form header, nothing related to forms here. This is our log out button, right? And then also our account card list. This list style none just gets rid of the bullet points for a list, but I'll let them be insert a little bit. All right, now we just need to import and apply these styles. Class name is going to be our account card, right? We've got our account card list. and then our logout button. Let's give that a look. Styles is not defined. Module not found. Account.module.css. Anybody see? Oh, I'm missing a C there. There we go. All right, so that's our account card. So we got logout here, but it doesn't actually log us out. So that's the next thing we need to implement, right? Obviously, we want it to log us out. So what's nice, buttons also have a on-click handler. I'm gonna say log out. Make sure that's working. You can see here on the console in the DevTools, I hit log out. There we go, it's logging log out to the console, right? And so what we want to do is, let's make a handle logout function. Right? And we'll handle our logout logic here, but really what we want to happen when we log out is a couple things. We want to get off the page, right? But we also want our data to be cleared out. We don't want them to have that data anymore. So I don't want to just grab the user context, but I also want to grab the auth context, right? And so I want to have set user as well. And then I also want set is authenticated and set token. We don't need these values, but we want to set them when we go to log out. So I'm going to, when we do log out, I'll set the user to just an empty object, right? I'll set the token and also set is authenticated to false. Anybody know why this is going to clear out my local storage? This will clear out the local. I'm sorry?
Because when you call back to the context, won't it call the local storage update?
Exactly. So it's, if you remember the use effects, they're monitoring user, token, and is authenticated flags, right? So when we look at these, if we look at these contexts, we've got these use effects set up that are watching these values. And if you remember the way use effect works, the variables that are passed into the array as a second argument, anytime those change, this function runs. So once those get set, it will then set the item on local storage, which will effectively set it to these null values or these empty values that we're providing on this logout handler. All right, so we got that set to the on click. Let's see what happens. All right, so you can see all that emptied out. Oh, we got some errors. What happened there? Set token is not a function. So what we need to do, we shouldn't really be staying on this page. What we need to do is force the user back to the login screen, right? But one thing, this error here is coming from this context. We didn't grab the right context to get these functions, right? So we don't have the user information anymore, but now when we hit logout, it's going to redirect us. There we go. So we got redirected. Why? It's because is authorized is now false, which ends up rendering the redirect component, but it has this to account. And I really want to go back to the account page as soon as I log in, right? So instead of just allowing it to push us through the redirect, we're going to manually use history. Sorry, actually, I want to grab that off of the React Router DOM. Right, we get our history reference. And we want to say history.push, and we'll go to the login page. Right? Now when we log in, all right, it pushed us back, but now when we hit log out, you can see the login page doesn't have that variable anymore. And if we log in again, it should take us to home. All right, so that now we've got all that behavior we want. We have the ability to log in, log out, etc. Right? And we have our context, so we have access to our token at any point that we're within this app. So now we're actually at a point where we have access to our auth. We can leave, log out, erase our information, come back in. But if you remember, on this route here that's getting hit, they find vehicles. I can look at my back end, which is running on 9500, right? And access all this just plain as day. So if somebody had access to this port on my machine, they could access this data, right? So what we're going to do now that we actually have our front end to a point where it has the ability to use the authentication information that it has, we're going to lock down our backend. We're going to lock down our MQTT broker, and we're going to update all our clients so that the only routes that you can actually access without authentication is our health check that we have here. Our login, and our documentation for our API. So I'm going to save this point here, do a commit. So we've got everything for our account page. All right. And we're going to lock down the cloud. So it's coming here. If you remember, we actually already set up our check for the JWT token on our post or provision route. We're going to leave login as is, right? But for example, get user, it says check and attach user. That's what checks for that JWT token coming in on the request. So this post checks it as well, but we want it here on this get. Right, we want to make sure that middleware runs, doesn't allow anybody to get in. We also want it here on vehicles. So you can't, so now that this is running, let's make sure the backend restarted. All right, so it started back up. If you look at this page now for vehicles, unauthorized, right? And that's what we want. We don't want somebody else to be able to access our vehicle data. Let's do the same thing for posting data. And getting the latest.
This little middle
Right.
thing looks pretty elegant, doesn't it? This is one of the unique things in JavaScript and Node that I really like, particularly in Express, is this ability to basically inject middleware in your routes. You'll see this kind of start to work in different platforms. but it's always a little bit cumbersome because of the language and the syntax and other languages like Python. We'll do a fast API thing here in the coming weeks, and you'll notice that there's a concept of middleware, but it's not as elegant and syntactically elegant and easy. So it's one of the really nice things about Node and JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it took what, about 30 seconds to require authentication, or at least a token to be passed for all of our routes that we want to lock down. I'm going to move these routes up top so we can group these no auth routes together. All right, let's put a little comment in here. No auth, right? And then everything below here, we know we want to require authentication.
Just so you guys know, typically we wouldn't put all this into one file. We might put all of the routes in file, but we would actually split out the handlers into separate files structurally, and cascade this whole thing. We're keeping it one file more for pedagogical reasons than anything. It's a little bit easier to see and think about, but when you get into actual production type stuff, it's better organized. You'll split out your routes into different things, different contextually relevant files and folders and stuff like that. It's relatively straightforward to do. So just so you know, that's not really how you typically see it out in the wild. And if you go and look at other, like if you're watching any other videos and stuff of while you're learning this stuff and looking at YouTube videos and stuff, you'll see people do some pretty crazy scaffolding where they've got all of these like nested routers and things like that for their Express. We like to keep it as simple as possible, but at the same time, you don't want to just shove everything in the same file. So, just wanted to mention that. So, if you see that typically I wouldn't suggest putting everything in one file like we're doing here.
Yeah, we typically have a little bit of nesting in a production system, right? But we also have quite a few routes to handle.
Right.
So it starts to get out of control fairly quickly.
Yeah, imagine all those CRUD routes. Like you've got create, read, update, delete for every single resource. And if you have 100 resources, you kind of have to.
Yeah, it's about 400 routes. Now, this vehicles page, if you guys can imagine, I just added that token requirement essentially. And so if I refresh this, I'm guessing something's not going to work. Look at there, 401. We have the token. So why aren't we getting it? It's because we haven't passed it into the request. So what we need to do is come back in here. If we look in our API for our get, we need to add the option to put that token in. So what we can do is we can actually put that in the headers. So I'm going to add a headers, set its default value to an empty object, and then I'll use the spread operator to add those headers here. All right, so now on the GET request, we can actually pass those headers in. So if we go back to the vehicle screen, where we see this GET request coming in, right? We want to be able to pass those headers in. But what we need, we're not actually pulling that context in yet. So we want to bring in the auth context, right? So we can say use context on the vehicle screen. And then we will import auth context. All right, remember we just need the token. Once we say use context. And then the header that it gets put on, let's go back to the middleware that we've got written in our cloud system here. So if we look at middleware, we've got check token. check and attach user, it's looking for a token call, or it's looking for a header called authorization. Now, Express by default converts all of its headers into lowercase, but the way that this would get sent in, and we already did this as a matter of fact to our client, right? Because we had to provision. You remember setting that header here? Authorization. And then we want to say bearer, give it a space, and place the token in there in that string. So when we call this on vehicles, we've got our API get call here. I'll pass in headers, and then the header we want to pass in is going to be called authorization. And its value would be bearer, give a space, and we place the token in. All right. Now we want to put this same thing in. We've got another get request here, so we've got to add it in on the latest data get request as well. All right, so let's check out our page again. Cannot destructure property token. All right, so what's going on here? Use context, auth context.
Is your auth context actually passing out token, or is it, I think you probably have to get it from the user and then token?
It was just the way I imported it.
Oh, okay.
There we go. All right. So we got our vehicles, home, right? It's able to do the request now, and that's all locked down. The next thing that we need to enforce the auth on is going to be the broker, right? So if we open up our, we close down a couple of tabs here. If we come down here to our MQTT broker, look at the index file, we need to hook up the auth plugin. So this is commented out. Now it's actually going to use what we have in this authentication file, which is going to look for a client username, or a username and password, right? It's possible that this password isn't going to have anything, so we do need to check that it's a string before, or check that it exists before we turn it to a string. If it doesn't, if we don't pass a username or password into the MQTT broker, we're just going to reject. It checks to see if it happens to be the gateway, so there's a special username and password for that. But otherwise, what it does is it looks for the password, right? And it creates an authorization header. What's it do there? So it actually sends a request back to our backend, checking this username, which in our case, when we try to log into the MQTT broker, if anybody recalls, our username is going to be the user UID, right? So in order to authenticate, if we're not the gateway, in which we're not in this case, we need to pass in for the username our user UID, and then for the password, we want to pass in that token. All right. Now this can be done right here on these options. So we want to add in our username. All right. We need our user UID. All right. So it looks like we got to bring in a whole nother context here, right? Let's look at our broker real quick. You seen these rejects, right? We gotta hook it up now that we actually added that authentication requirement. Not just anybody can connect to our broker. We gotta bring down our user context to be able to get that user UID. Right, we can pull the user off of there, and then our username is just going to be user.uid, and our password will be the token. All right, let's watch the broker, see if we actually get a connection now once this thing restarts. There we go. Our client connected. Now I'm going to change the client name. I'll just call this the front end client, just so that we know that in this particular case, because it could be like a vehicle connecting up to the broker, we know that we have one of our front ends is connected up right now, and it's actually subscribed to the data topic. So we managed to, one, lock down our MQTT broker, and two, actually authenticate with it via our front end. All right, so all those different things that we put in place the past couple weeks are finally meshing together, right? But in order for this full system to run, we're actually going to need to update a couple other, one other file. So we have, what do we have here? We've got our Python client that loads up and provisions our vehicles. We've got our embedded simulation, right? We've got our front end, that's already been hooked up. Our auth is added for MQTT broker, and our auth has been added for the cloud. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually load up the sign-in to this vehicle.py simulation, right? We've already got those credentials here in the client. So I'll bring those in. I'll say log into backend here. And then the login, we can actually crib from this client as well. Right, it's gonna log in. We don't have to run a health check. It gets that token and then sets some request headers. And then if you look at what we do on the client to actually send it, you pass those request headers and on the request.post. Right, so let's, the field is just called headers. Let's just see anywhere else we use request. So this request.get wouldn't work unless we have our headers, right? And we also need it for this post since we added the auth to that as well.
Now, who sees a problem with all of this? Not the code, but the concept.
The vehicle has to know the user information, right?
Yeah, the vehicle has to know the username or password. So think of the user experience of that. How would we go through that? It's probably not a winning user experience, right? I mean, we're doing this here because obviously that's the quick way to make this whole thing work together. But JC, did you already have something planned to go through?
No, we'll have to actually add some embedded,
Yeah.
or
Well,
force routes to be considered embedded, right?
yeah, I just didn't want to steal your thunder if you were planning on doing that. So let's have a conversation about how that would actually work. So if we think about it, what we're doing there in the embedded is we would basically be having we're embedding a username and password, a personal username, email, and password into the vehicle in order to authenticate. Now, I could see in some cases that could, maybe it could work. The only way the vehicle would ever be able to report to the cloud is if the person gets into it, connects to their vehicle with their Bluetooth, sends those credentials over the Bluetooth to the vehicle, and then the vehicle uses that in order to report up to the cloud. At that point, you're kind of like, wait, why doesn't the vehicle just send the data out to the Bluetooth, and then the phone actually acts as the IoT light sort of strategy? So there's a number of things. Obviously, none of that is a viable solution, right? Because you're completely dependent upon the driver in order to get any data from the vehicle. You don't want to do that. What OEM actually wants that? No one wants any dependence on the driver for their telemetry. So, What's that?
The dealership, when you take the car out of dealership, so they may have access to put in all the details while buying the car, right?
They do, yeah. In fact, what I would say, oh, you mean the actual like email and password?
Yes.
Well, what happens if someone changes their password for their email?
No, I mean, when you buy the car, you have to put in all the information, like you just, open an account or something like that.
Good. There's a big thing about not. Oh, I see. So there's a provisioning flow, so that you basically do the authentication, everything, claim the vehicle, and is the vehicle given the actual password? No, right? Yeah. So I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, I like that from a provisioning flow. That's cool. Let's think about what the vehicle would actually do though. Like how would the vehicle authenticate with the cloud? So I like that idea, Reeve, of when you buy the vehicle, you go through provisioning flow. So there's a provisioning web experience that the user joins up, and then there's the VIN, right? That's in the and you've already it the VIN is in the vehicle's been virtually created right into the cloud. It's run off the line. This is done at the factory at manufacturing. You claim the VIN, which is what you do now, like with OnStar, right, or Sync or whatever. And then your account is joined to that VIN. But that
That is
V,
what we do in the badge, the company badge, and we renew the badge, right? You go to the badge office. There is a chip embedded already in that. All the information is there. So
right.
you have to authenticate our code, passcode, and the badge office who are issuing the code. Then
Mm,
from there on, it's active. So I
right.
just use that
No,
same.
like it's like that. So the idea actually would be, how does the vehicle work? Well, the vehicle would actually be given certificates or its own username or password. Let's make it simple. Its own username or password at the factory. At which point, its credentials are totally different than the user's credentials. And in fact, in the database, if you think about it, we really haven't put that in. But from an authentication standpoint, you would actually provide a secret and a key or something like, or certificates, right? Just like we talked about SSL, TLS, cryptographically signed certificates, and you'd store them into the database for that vehicle in the cloud. It's a pretty safe place because we control that, right? But then you basically give the key or the secret to the vehicle, and it stores it in an encrypted space inside of its computing. So it's ECU or it's in, wherever it's storing, and there's trust authorities and things like that that you can do on the hardware side, and it would store those and then use that to authenticate with the cloud. And so